Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. Until now, this podcast has dealt exclusively with the Western European Middle Ages. Today, we're going to branch out to a more global perspective by comparing medieval European knights with Japanese samurai. And I can think of no better historian to make this comparison than my old friend, Professor Stephen Morillo. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here.
Stephen Morillo is Professor Emeritus of History at Wabash College, where he taught medieval, world, and military history for, as he put it, way too long. His first book, and the book over which we bonded, was Warfare Under the Anglo-Norman Kings, 1066 to 1135, which was published in 1994. His most recent book is War and Conflict in the Middle Ages, A Global Perspective, which pretty much sums up Stephen's scholarly odyssey from Anglo-Norman military historian to pre-modern world historian. Stephen and I go back a long time. He claims to have known me since I was a mere toddler, but that would have made him a fetus at the time. So perhaps
an advanced fetus.
An advanced fetus. So perhaps it's only been 30 plus years that we've known each other. I know that we met at an academic conference, but I'm not sure whether it was at Kalamazoo, which is your new hometown, or was it at Haskins in Houston?
It was at the Haskins in Houston, because I remember you said we bonded over my first book. In my mind, we bonded over your book, the book you didn't call Blood on the Axe.
But I thought that lordship and military application in Anglo-Saxon England was a really sexy title. Who knew?
and because, as you've said about Haskins, it was a place to meet your footnotes, and yours was a book I had read and admired, and I thought, oh, I want to meet Richard Abels. And so when I did, it was at the Haskins at the Allen Park Inn in Houston, Texas.
I hope you weren't as disappointed as our friend Mary Frances was when she met me after having read my book. It was at Kalamazoo, and it was at one of those night mixers, and she came over to me and she looked at me and said, "You're Richard Abels? You look nothing like your book." Yeah, I was supposed to be 6'5", blonde hair, blue eyed, looks like a Hemsworth brother, but nah, that turned out not to be the case. So, yeah, Stephen and I have known each other for a very long time. We've known each other long enough to have co-authored an article together, and also to have planned and failed to compile a medieval source book. I'm afraid toward the end of my teaching career, I got a lot better at signing book contracts than delivering on them.
Well, I've done the same thing. It happens to all of us.
So Stephen is an honest-to-God Renaissance man. In his retirement, he still writes history, but he focuses more on his other lifelong interests, which are oil painting, cartooning, and illustrating. Didn't that have something to do with your selection as a Rhodes Scholar? Or was it just simply your athletic prowess?
Oh, I was an all-star at, name your sport. I could do anything.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
No, I was definitely, the Rhodes at that time had a reputation as the sort of scholar athlete, but it was becoming the scholar and something else. And yeah. I offered the scholar artist approach. I was a cartoonist and painter even back then. I had been all my life, longer than I've been an historian in some ways. So that was part of what got me a Rhodes.
Out of curiosity, why did you go into history rather than go into art?
For a long time, I hadn't really fully decided between the two for far longer than it would seem like. I started doing a comic strip in third grade, which was the
third grade?
Third grade, yes, which was the same year that I became a St. Louis Cardinals fan. So
Oh,
this was a major
this
point
is
in
a
my life.
very, very sad topic, isn't it?
Yeah, right now it is, but yeah, my brother's a Cubs fan, and I'm up on him 3-1 or no, 5-1 in terms of World Series titles during our lifetime. So,
Uh,
and it was also the year in like third grade history class we did the Greeks and the Persians, the Battle of Marathon and all
yeah.
that sort of stuff, and I just fell in love with it. So that sort of not just history but military history was fascinating to me from an early age. How did I get from there to medieval? Was that I kept pursuing this military history interest. I read Bruce Catton's trilogy about the American Civil War in sixth grade. But then in high school, I grew up in New Orleans. My
Yeah.
father taught at Tulane. My mother taught at the University of New Orleans. And I went to the Tulane Library and discovered these two books on the shelf: The Military Organization of Norman England and Anglo-Saxon Military Institutions by Warren Hollister.
Alistair. Yeah.
And I read devoured those books and thought, yeah, this is what I want to do.
Mm.
And when I got to college, I had this idea as a freshman that became the a kernel of my first book, which was this idea that the reason cavalry was so effective in the Middle Ages is that good infantry required good states to bring it together and train it.
Yes.
And Anglo-Norman England seemed to me a sort of interesting case study on a state that was precociously good and whose knights often dismounted to fight, as you know.
Yes.
So I sort of followed that to do the Anglo-Norman warfare dissertation, which became the first book. And that sort of set me into being a medievalist.
How did you go from being a Western medievalist to being a world historian?
Yeah, I'd actually already taught a world history course. My first teaching assignments, I managed to hook on part time at Loyola University in New Orleans. The first course I taught was a medieval survey, but then they said, we've got this world history survey we need a section of it of the first half of world history taught. And I said, I can do that. I can do anything, but that I should be able to do. And I really liked it. My mother's a philosopher, and I think I inherited from her an inclination to do big explanations, to generalize as high as possible. And I realized that in order to do that about warfare, I'd need examples from more than just one culture. I'd already done my senior honors thesis in college on the Bulgarian Wars of Basil II, the
Mhm.
Byzantine emperor,
Yeah.
and therefore I had this interest, and I got the opportunity. And then my second year teaching at Wabash, I got an NEH summer study grant to look at medieval Japanese warfare, and read a bunch of stuff, and that produced an article that compared Japan and Europe in terms of the development of infantry warfare and the influence of gunpowder. It was called Guns and Government.
Really, really good work.
Oh, thank
I
you.
I was always very impressed with it, and I taught it in class.
Really, that's nice. I love, as a longtime teacher, I always love the intersection between research and teaching. I learned most of what I used in writing my world history textbook by teaching world history for a long time and figuring out how to explain things to a class and what would make sense conceptually.
Yeah, yeah, really. That's a good segue to today's topic of discussion, knights and samurai. Older world history textbooks like to compare what they call feudal Japan with medieval Europe. And in this comparison, the samurai was presented as the knights of Japan. And in older Western Civ textbooks and medieval surveys, you see the knight as presented as being at the very heart and center of a feudal system of government and feudal warfare. And both of these are myths.
That's right.
Let's start with an overview of what a knight was and what a samurai was. I know that you can do both, but since I can't, how about I talk about knights, something I actually know, and you can feel free to correct me if you disagree, and you then tell our listeners about samurai.
Okay.
So, what is a knight? I think that for most of our listeners, the word knight conjures an image of a warrior in full plate armor, the type of armor actually worn at the very end of the Middle Ages and throughout the Renaissance. He sits on a horse, a heavily armored horse, readying himself for combat in either in battle or in a joust in a tournament. The secondary image is a courtier in a noble court, dressed in rich robes, who woos damsels courteously. This was my idea of what a knight was when I was a kid. It came from stories and movies about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, with an assist from movies like Ivanhoe. Knights were supposed to be chivalrous. Good knights served the king loyally, they were courageous, they upheld justice, and they defended women and the weak. They were knight errant, riding off on adventures, often alone or just accompanied by a squire, seeking out wrongs that they could correct. Those wrongs were often perpetrated by bad knights, powerful noblemen who abused their rank and privilege and oppressed the weak. They played the role of antagonists in the movies to be overcome by the good knights. For most of our listeners, the image conjured of a knight probably has less to do with the Round Table than with the television shows based on George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones and currently A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. George R. R. Martin's knights are also derived from late medieval knighthood and have much in common with the knights I grew up with. And once again, they are members of a military elite, though some may be poor hedge knights. When they're dubbed knights, they take an oath. In George R. R. Martin's novel, A Storm of Swords, the oath is, quote, to defend those who cannot defend themselves, to protect all women and children, to obey your captains, your liege lord, and your king, to fight bravely when needed, and to do such other tasks as are laid upon you, however hard or humble or dangerous they may be. It's a really nice medieval oath.
That's right.
In Martin's novel, The Hedged Knight, and in the television series A Game of Thrones, the vow of knighthood is given as, quote, in the name of the warrior, I charge you to be brave. In the name of the father, I charge you to be just. In the name of the mother, I charge you to defend the young and innocent. In the name of the maid, I charge you to protect all women, end quote. The religious context belongs to the mythos of Westeros, but the ideal is authentically medieval, as is the notion that knighthood, ideally, is an order of society that is morally as well as socially noble. Like I said, this conception of knighthood has a real medieval pedigree. It can be found throughout medieval romances, Jean-Jean's Digest, and handbooks of chivalry from the mid-12th through the 15th century and beyond. It draws upon authentic knighting rituals and the vows taken when one joined a secular order of knighthood, such as the English Order of the Garter, which themselves drew upon literary portrayals of knights and chivalry. But the Middle Ages is a very long period, and historically, this idealized conception of knighthood is the product of a centuries long evolution. So let's start with what a knight originally was by considering the terms for knighthood. The term knight derives from an Old English word, knecht, which is related to the German Knecht, and both of them essentially mean a boy. They mean a retainer, someone who's a subordinate. It's
Right.
kind of interesting when you think of what our conception of a knight is, that in England, the knight arises from this subordinate position, because what it emphasized is that the knight was a servant, the knight was a retainer. If you look at the terms that we used elsewhere in medieval Europe, in France it's chevalier, which
Yeah.
means horseman, and in Spain it's cavallarius, which
Yeah.
means horseman, and in Germany it's not knecht, it's ritter, which
Yes.
means horseman.
Right. Yes,
And what it does is it emphasizes what separates the knight from other types of warriors is that the knight is seen as being a warrior who is on horseback.
that's right.
Uh,
Although I would add that the original Latin term for knight, miles, as you
yes,
know, meant elite warrior in Roman times, and
and infantry.
the elite warriors of Rome were the legionnaires, so they were infantrymen. But by the time you get to at least the 10th century in Western Europe, the elite warriors, socially elite warriors, and well, people who have enough money to arm themselves, are riding horses the way elites all over the world rode horses, because horses are a great symbol of being elite. They put you high up and give you an advantage.
And they're also expensive to maintain, and you need leisure to be able to master horsemanship.
Yeah,
And that brings us to the transformation. The Middle Ages is 1,000 years.
or
The
more, according to some.
according to some, yeah. And the term miles is the term in Latin that we translate it as knight
Yeah,
when we see it. If we're looking at documents from the early 11th century and we see miles, we shouldn't think of this as being a, a member of a social elite because the milites of the 10th and 11th centuries were basically military retainers.
yeah,
They were
they were.
people who belonged to maybe a household, belonged to what they would call a familia, and not necessarily a member of an elite. But by the 13th century, if you have a term knight, what we're talking about is a person who belongs to the highest level of the social stratum.
Right.
And it's a transformation where the knight doesn't simply become a retainer, but becomes the member of an aristocracy, a
Right.
military, at least conceptually, a military aristocracy. Now, the knights that I'm most familiar with are the knights from England. I'm an
Yeah.
English historian. And those knights in England by the 13th century are more bureaucrats than warriors.
Yeah, that's right. They staff the local government.
They do. And in fact, it is so expensive to go through the ceremony of knighting and then to have to take up the responsibilities of being a knight that you have a lot of these young men and probably their fathers who don't want to spend the money on this, who choose not to become knights, and the government has to create a mechanism to force them to take it. And so what you end up having in English common law is something called distraint of knighthood, which
Yes,
means that if you choose not to become a knight, you have to pay a fine.
that's right. Because the government needs either your service or your money. So
Yes.
they got to
And
force you into this thing that your social status supposedly would have been automatic for you.
and so what you have is the knighthood becoming really defined as a social stratum rather than as a profession, rather than as a um, activity. And by that time, what knighthood is also associated with is not just warfare, but courtliness.
Yes,
And chivalry has become not just simply what it initially was, which is the ethos of the horseman, the ethos of the warrior on horseback, with the emphasis on prowess and the emphasis upon loyalty and
right.
courage. It also becomes now courtliness with an emphasis upon being a ornament in a lord's court, knowing how to speak to ladies, flirt well without going overboard in it, and maybe creating problems. Sing, dance, play musical instruments, even compose poetry. It's a completely different world.
It is, and I would add, because it'll be important in explaining what's going on with samurai, that I think the cultural code of chivalry is in part an attempt by the knightly class to justify their existence, to
Yes,
say that this is our role in society, and this is why we deserve it, because we are courtly.
absolutely. And that brings us to the central myth of the knight, which is that the knight is the very heart of medieval warfare. I think that you see movies, great, you see all these movies, it's always the charge of the knights.
Yes.
Now, the problem with this is, as you know, as military historians of this period, we know that battles were actually very rare in the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages.
You were much more likely to conduct a siege, and as almost anybody will tell you, you can't take a castle by charging its wall with a cavalry charge.
Nah, and the word siege itself comes from the word for sitting, and
Yes.
that's what sieges are. You sit
Yeah.
around the castle for a very long time.
Yes.
Men on horseback are important for
Yep.
sieges and for ravaging. The mobility of being on a horse gives you, for recon purposes, it's
That's right.
important. If you are attacked while you're having a siege, it's nice to have horsemen.
That's right.
And in skirmishes, horsemen are always good to have.
Oh yeah.
But full-scale battles are rare, and the basic military strategy for much of the period that we study, from the at least the middle of the 11th century through the middle of the 15th century, that this basic strategy is you cross over the border, you start ravaging as soon as you can. That's how you feed your troops. That's how you deprive the enemy of economic resources.
Right.
And after burning a bunch of villages and burning fields and tearing down some mills, you then lay siege to their castles and wait for their food to run out or try to bring down a castle wall or a town wall. And the basic defensive strategy is for the defending force to shadow the invaders, not to force them into battle, but to pick off foraging parties and make it more difficult for the invader to ravage the countryside and for the defenders to garrison the castles and the walled cities and to wait out the sieges.
And you conduct that siege only if you're actually looking to seize land permanently. If not, simply the raiding and plundering itself is an end that is worthwhile.
I'm not going to say knights are not important, but they are part of a system. And you need
Yeah.
foot soldiers for this. You need engineers. You need all of that. And the other problem is that, and this brings us to the medievalist F word, knights are so associated with feudalism
Yes.
that the conception of the knight is not just simply the man on horseback in heavy armor. The knight is an individual who is part of the feudal system. He is the warrior who holds land from a lord in return for specified military service.
Right. And that land is called a fief, which in Latin is feudum, which is where we get feudalism.
Exactly. I'm one of the people who actually will continue to use the word feudalism because I like to shock my colleagues.
Yeah.
But
The medieval F word, he used it.
yes, I can't believe it. No, but it always struck me that where we see the most feudal societies in medieval Europe are those that are conquest polities. So we
Yeah.
see them in Anglo-Norman England, we see them in Norman Sicily and southern Italy, and we see them in the so-called Crusader states,
State of states. That's
the
right.
Latin polities of Outremer, and we see it in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
All the places that are conquest kingdoms have individuals who are holding land in return for military service.
And that I think is partly because fief holding became sort of the basis for land law, and that has significant later history that we probably won't need to go into today. But
Yeah,
fief holding became that important, but not necessarily as a military system.
exactly. Feudal military obligation was a double-edged sword for kings and for other lords. On the one hand, it meant free military service, which was always welcomed. On the other hand, as a contractual relationship, it had limitations that made that service less than optimal for the actual conduct of warfare.
the traditional feudal service terms, I'll give you a fee if you will serve me for 40
Yes,
days a year, is ridiculous as a way of forming a military system.
totally.
No king would rely on an army that will evaporate in 40 days. It takes 40 days to get to the campaign theater.
And this helps explain an otherwise really puzzling development in the administrative and military history of medieval England in the 13th century. So-called servitium debitum, the service that is owed for landholding, this feudal military service owed by tenants in chief to the crown,
Right.
declined throughout the 13th century. I'll give you some numbers here. In 1166, King Henry II could summon 5,000 knights on the basis of feudal obligation. That was at least in theory what he could do. In 1272, his great grandson, Edward I, was owed 300 to 500 knights from the lay nobility and an additional 132 from bishops and abbots. 90% of knight service owed to the crown had evaporated within 1 century. And the
It became a
quality
tax
of,
system partly.
yeah, and the quality of troops raised by a feudal summons also declined
Yeah.
as sergeants, lower in both economic and social status, less well armed, increasingly replaced quote unquote knights, the heavily, fully armored man on horseback. In 1277, Edward I mustered for the Welsh War 228 knights and 294 sergeants, serving without pay for 40 days. In 1303, the feudal component of the army that Edward I took to Scotland had fallen to 15 knights
Yeah.
and 267 sergeants out of
And
a total force of 7,500 men.
that's right.
What replaced it was a combination of mercenaries and voluntary service. In the 13th century, the most common summons is for out of love and loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
Send to me what you can. And
Yes.
and the quid pro quo for that is royal favor or royal disfavor if
Yeah.
you don't answer that summons. And the best way of making use of feudal obligation is not by getting those knights, but by getting money
Yep.
instead of those knights. And that's called scutage.
Scutage, shield money, then pay for your replacement, whom we're going to have to hire.
At the very center of medieval warfare in the High Middle Ages is the mercenary.
That's right.
The nice thing about a mercenary, we think of mercenaries bad. Mercenaries are unreliable. Machiavelli wrote about how you can't trust mercenaries until, of course, the Florentine civilian militia that he trained got crushed by mercenary army.
Right.
The point about mercenaries are they will serve you as long as you pay them.
And they had a sense of professional honor and dignity.
Yeah.
There were mercenaries who refused to surrender a castle unless they were recognized as having done their job.
Well, it's partly necessary for your resume.
That's right.
Who's going to hire you if you turn on your former employer?
Yeah.
And they also don't have any land to lose. So much
Yeah.
of medieval warfare was basically what we would call civil wars,
Mm-hmm.
and you'd have to choose a side. And if you were on the losing side and you held land, you lost the land.
Yeah.
Much better to get mercenaries.
Oh yeah,
Much better.
they're more reliable as long as you have the money. Now that this raises the problem that the money supply is often unreliable, but
Yes,
it's still, if you have the money, mercenaries are in effect professionals. They're not these sort of part timers whom the feudal soldiers could be seen as.
exactly. Okay, we've talked about knights. Now, why don't you tell us about samurai?
Yes, what is a samurai? Well, there's some interesting parallels. It's not unreasonable to compare samurai and knights. It's just that they're not really the same thing. So the term samurai comes from the Japanese verb sabaru, to serve. So they're servants.
Yeah.
And they are not necessarily members of the bushi, which is the Japanese term for the class of elite warriors. And bushi is purely a class term. It has no implications of cavalry or infantry service militarily. They are warriors. So the samurai were originally sort of rural policemen for the court, the royal court at Kyoto in Heian, Japan. They were therefore attached to the elites, but the elites were the courtly ones. They were a civil aristocracy with their own codes of honor and behaviors and so forth. And as a rural police force, the original samurai, were definitely a class down. They were lower than that, but they had low elite level status with that definite divide between the court and the warriors. And that's partly because only the court elite had legitimacy. They were attached to the emperor and then after 1180, there was the divide between court and warriors was in a way formalized, because after a civil war, a warrior government was created. This is the Kamakura shogunate.
Yes.
And what that was that there was an imperial court in Kyoto, and there was the shogunate was elsewhere, and it was the government for the rural warriors, as opposed to the government for the courts and landholding in the central government.
Landholding is shogun holding?
Yes, and what happens is that the warriors then are, I'm going to use the word paid, they're not really paid, they're retained, and their reward is a shoen, which is not a fief. A fief that a knight is enfeoffed with, it still belongs to the king, it's theoretically revocable. Yes. But as all medievalists know, if you give someone a piece of land conditionally like that, it tends to become hereditary. Land is hard to revoke. What a shoen was a grant of the financial rights to or arising from some piece of land. The trouble is that shoens could be granted in bits and pieces. They could be granted. It did not create a tie to the land the way fief holding did. Yeah. Local knights, as you know, this is why they served as bureaucrats in local governments, had intimate relations with their peasants as rulers.
Yeah.
Samurai shoen holders did not. They collected their money from the central government, and there was theoretically a piece of land that generated that money, but they didn't have a governing relation. It's a grant of a bundle of rights instead of actual land holding and governance. And what happens then is that because there's now this military government, it's in tension with the civilian government. It depends for its legitimacy on the civilian government, but if push comes to shove in terms of landholding rights between courtly aristocrats and these samurai, guess who's got the swords?
Yeah.
So things tend to drift in that direction, but they still need the courtly government for legitimacy that comes through the emperor. The shoen holders, these samurai, start to develop a cultural code like the knights do with chivalry. It's called Bushido. It's the way of the warrior.
For the same reason? To be able to separate themselves out?
Yes, it's a sort of class justification for violence wielders. But it's more dependent still on that sort of overall sense of legitimacy. And the interesting thing is that what the way of the warrior really meant in this period, let's say from the time of the rise of warrior government in the 1180s down through 1477, the end of the Onin War, what Bushido meant was the way of the horse and bow. And we'll come back to that, I think.
Like Mongols rather than like the knights.
They are light cavalry horse archers. And that's not like the knights. They're elite warriors in a sense. They're armored. They're the only warriors in Japan. One of the interesting things about Japan is that they'd established a sort of national defense system when they were almost never under threat by invasion from outside. The Mongols managed it twice, and in both cases, it ended in disaster because of the
Kamikaze.
kamikaze.
Yeah.
The divine winds came and
Yes.
sank
Yes.
their fleets. Um, so one of the things this means in terms of Bushido, and Bushido later developed into the occult of the sword, but that's in the Edo period. That's in the 17th century, really. So it's a post-medieval development.
What I
So
love about that is that it develops after the introduction of gunpowder,
yes,
the way of the sword, and it develops after the period in which you have a lot of warfare going on.
yes, yes.
It's a
It develops in
The
the
way
Edo
of the
period.
sword is a period of peace.
It becomes a symbol of class status, is what the sword is, and like knights, but even more extremely, samurai in the 16th century onward were bureaucrats. The,
What I what always struck me about the rise of chivalry and its connection with courtliness, and I would really date that from the middle of the 12th century uh, on, and it's people like Chrétien de Troyes who really
yeah,
establish it. Is that this is the same period as the commercial revolution and the rise of a merchant class that has wealth and sometimes more wealth
yeah,
than at least the younger sons of these
right,
landowners. So how do you make yourself superior to
yeah,
individuals who are in fact wealthier than you are? Well, you assert it, and you
yes,
assert it because you have qualities that they don't have.
that's right. That
And
you've got a thing, a sword or something. You've got this status that you build a whole sort of cultural superstructure around that distinguishes you from these people who might have more money, but they're
yeah, but they can never be us
that's right.
because we have, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's a wonderful way of self-defining yourself as an elite.
Yes,
And well, at least in Italy, the way that they do it is they marry into the wealthier business families, and
yeah,
therefore they can have both their
yes,
land in the countryside and the money
that's right.
from business.
Which later English knighthood, starting in the like 17th century, adopts enthusiastically as old aristocratic families marry the new rich merchant families, and that's more possible in some ways in England, I think, than in much of continental Europe.
What about the concept of honor? That seems to be central to the notion of knighthood and of
Yeah,
chivalry,
and
is
I
this
think
idea of honor.
I agree, and I think that notions of honor seem to be common to warrior elites around the world in all ages. Um, that the it maybe has to do with the fact that you're exercising a sort of makes right ideology, and you need constraints on that, especially within that class. And one of the things to note is that both Bushido and chivalry are very class bound codes of honor.
Yes.
That is, you have to be honorable to other knights or to other samurai. That does not extend to being honorable to the peasants, whom you're free to plunder and exploit. And it's not it's in an awkward relationship with religious codes of honor because it's only pseudo chivalry and bushido are only pseudo religious. They're connected with religious ideas, but they're not drawing authority from the same fountain.
That's interesting. Part of
So
what
so go ahead.
part of the honor of knighthood is that you are loyal to your lord, that you've sworn loyalty and that you abide by your loyalty. But the Lord's honor is reciprocal, that
That's
the
right.
Lord is obliged to protect and maintain the men who have done fidelity, have sworn fidelity, and who have done homage
That's right.
to the Lord.
The
What about
feudal
Japan?
Well, the feudal relationship, as you point out in Europe, is essentially a contract between social equals.
Yes,
They may have different social
which
statuses,
is the
but
reason why in the homage you lift up the vassal and you exchange a kiss.
that's right.
Because as long as the vassal is kneeling, he's a subordinate. But
That's right.
lifting him up and exchanging the kiss emphasizes that they are equals.
That's right. They're both free men. They have the right to bear weapons. So
Yes.
a contract can only be valid between free men. Uh, the Japanese social structure is somewhat different. And the code of honor is somewhat different. There is strong emphasis on being loyal to your lord and obeying your lord. One of the things that every legal historian knows is that any law which is repeated and emphasized is probably also regularly broken.
Yes.
And
Yes.
this is true of the samurai. There is such an emphasis on loyalty, and it's often at the level of clan loyalty that one clan is subordinate, is dependent on a higher clan, because it was so easy to break that. And conversely, the lords in the Japanese hierarchy did not have the same sense of obligation to protect and um, not serve, but reciprocate their vassals. They had much more autocratic powers. They could order their vassals. At what developed in the 12th century was they could order them as a form of punishment to commit suicide.
That's a I can't even imagine that
You're
in
right.
a Western European context.
No, well,
That,
suicide is such a sin in the Christian religion that I think that was foreclosed religiously in a fairly
yeah, but
firm
you can't
way.
do that. So this ritual suicide, seppuku,
Yeah.
uh, how does it develop? What is it?
Uh, well, it's interesting. It starts out, it actually grows from the bottom up. That is, ritual suicide was not initially ordered from the top. It was the sort of thing that, especially starting in the Genpei Wars that led to the first shogunate in 1180, um, warriors would simply do. And my analysis of this, I think what this has to do with is that in samurai against samurai warfare, especially early on like that, individuals got glory and honor, got points, in effect, not literal points, but got recognition for killing significant foes, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So if you took down someone who was very famous and had a lot of authority, that his honor sort of came to you because you'd killed him. So what develops is that some warriors decided, I'm going to deprive, I'm in a bad situation here, surrounded. I'm going to deprive the enemy of the points for killing me by killing myself. So I get my points. And that works because the points are really adhering to a clan rather than to an individual. So that I've killed myself, my clan gets that glory. And in addition, you've both deprived the enemy and given yourself the points. And that becomes ingrained enough that the lords at some point can take it over and say, okay, the honorable thing for you to do is to kill yourself, and because you've disobeyed me and so forth. And it changes as the social situation changes. The early samurai government, Heian era shogunate, was much less centralized and less bloody, I guess, than later ones. What happens is that in the 14th century, there's a civil war in the imperial royal house, and there for a while are two lines of the royal house who are competing. And what that does is destroys the legitimacy machine, such that the local warrior lords start looking out for themselves more and depend less on the central government, and warfare becomes a little bit more about actually taking land. You didn't have to take land in earlier Japanese warfare because what you wanted to do was defeat the enemy people and then have their land granted to you by the central government. It still had to come through the government. But when the government broke down, that system broke down a bit. And what that ends up with is the wars of the 15th century. Japan is divided into a bunch of small states. The daimyo domains are independent states, and effectively. Nobody refers to them that way in Japanese history because it's such a foreign concept. But they start building little states that are more bureaucratic and castle-based, because suddenly holding your land matters. And in that same period, as they're building up these states, they start discovering that it's actually a good idea to raise large amounts of infantry to hold those castles and to win battles, perhaps in a less honorable way, but who cares about honor at that point, because the honor system is broken down and you want the land.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can see this development in a piece of evidence called the 17 Articles of Asakura Toshiagi, who was one of these daimyo domain holders, and he compiled this near the end of his life, or shortly after his death, which was in 1481. It contains the following advice: one should not be overly fond of famous swords and daggers, for even if one has a sword valued at 10,000 cash, he will not overcome 100 men carrying spears valued at 100 cash. Therefore, if one has 10,000 cash and buys 100 spears, having 100 men to carry them, he should be able to protect an entire flank. And so this is the context in which the cult of the sword arises.
Yes, I love this.
It's totally cultural. It's a sort of elite class marker, because once the country is actually unified at the end of these long civil wars, first under Hideyoshi and Obunaga, Hideyoshi, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu. This is the story told in Shogun. Once the country's unified, the class divisions suddenly solidify. During this period of warfare, it was easier to move up and down the social status because you could do so on the basis of merit. Once the country's unified, they want to cut that off. They want to say, nope, everything's set now. If you're a samurai now, you're a samurai forever. Nobody else can become a samurai. And the sword is the symbol of this.
There is some similarity here to the evolution of knighthood. In the turbulent and violent 11th century, the milites were an open group defined by their function as warrior retainers. But as central authority increased in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire in the 13th century, knighthood became largely confined to those who could demonstrate they were of knightly lineage. The son of a noble, even of a king, would still have to be knighted to have that status, but his pedigree guaranteed that he would be if he so desired. Medieval knighthood never became a completely closed caste. Men-at-arms who distinguished themselves in combat could be elevated to knighthood by kings, but that was really rare. It seems that some of the same political, military, and social developments that you talked about as closing the ranks of the samurai in Japan served to restrict access to knighthood in 13th century Western Europe. In both cases, it seems to have been to establish and maintain political stability by tying the military elite more closely to the central authority. So now that Tokugawa Ieyasu has finally ended the civil wars and established the unified Japan under his shogunate, we are now going to have a stable government, which means everything's frozen in place.
Everything is frozen in place. And it's a delicate freezing operation, because the clans that win, the Tokugawa clan essentially that wins, does not eliminate all of the other daimyo domains. They gather them into a sort of federated system with the Tokugawa clan at the head. So they've got to sort of buy the loyalty of all those samurai by saying, yes, you're samurai, you have these swords, and you're our important subordinates. And there's a ranking of subordinate houses and so forth, but it's a way of making the peace without having to really conquer everybody. And that establishes a delicate system that's very resistant to change from 1603, when Tokugawa Ieyasu essentially wins those civil wars, to the 1850s, when this American fleet arrives, and
Yes.
suddenly they've got to deal with change, and then that leads to a whole nother period of Japanese history.
So one of the things that I think makes people compare knights to samurai
Yeah.
is the assumption that they must have been similar militarily, that they're both heavily armored military men. So here's what the knight conceptually was:
Yeah.
heavily armored horsemen whose arms were for hand-to-hand melee combat. Uh, he charges in a group with others with a lance, and when the lances are broken, they then resort to their swords, banging each other on their heads with it. That is not a inaccurate way of portraying what happens in melees in tournaments.
That's right.
It's, in fact, much of what we think of as way of the night is really the way of the tournament night.
Yeah. It's the couched lance charge followed by hacking it at each other with swords.
Yeah. And the stuff you see in the TV shows like Game of Thrones is when you have the knights charging against each other in lists, one on one. It's a later version of
Yeah.
the earlier melee. But
Oh,
the
the
earlier
term.
melee was basically war games.
Yeah.
It was a mock battle, not
Yep.
not meant to kill each other. You'd have some foot soldiers involved if
Yep.
people wanted to bring them. But mainly what it was to increase the individual honor of the participant and also to increase his revenues by knocking people off their horses, taking their horses, and taking their armor.
Right. Right.
That's, yeah,
Which was a perfectly viable start to a career path, as William the Marshal can
yeah.
show you.
But the point is, prowess was not only the ability to be able to break heads, but with the right weapons. You
Yeah.
had to be a horseman. You had to be able to use lance. You had to be able to use sword, maybe a mace.
Right.
You didn't use a pitchfork. You
No.
didn't use
No.
any lower class, and you don't really you use
Or
the lance as a pike, but
right.
you don't use things like halberds. That's
And
foot
knights.
soldier stuff.
Right. And knights also never used bows, especially not crossbows.
No, they don't use
That
bows.
that
That's just not done.
anybody can use a crossbow. Well, it makes what's knightly about that?
And what and the introduction of gunpowder really is a crisis
Yeah.
because all that stuff that a knight prides himself on being able to do is not really at all useful anymore. And knights have to be transformed into infantry commanders,
Yeah.
giving orders to the people who are serving under them. And that's a real transformation.
Yeah, and it's a not unuseful one because as armies got bigger, it's easier to raise large numbers of infantry because they're cheaper per person. And as armies got bigger, you needed more commanders, subordinate commanders, and the knightly elite were a fine source of that sort of subordinate commander. Now, so there's knights militarily.
Yeah.
The samurai, it's and we'll start this in the early period before the breakdown of legitimacy. The samurai, as I said earlier, the Bushido was the way of horse and bow. They were essentially light cavalry riding horses that were significantly smaller and weaker than European horses and wearing less heavy armor. They still wore a fair amount of armor, but it was not sheet metal or even chainmail. It tended to be more pieces of molded leather and various things like that. And shooting a bow. The bow was the key weapon of the samurai at first. And what they shot were long bows. They were a good 6 feet long, but unlike the English longbows made out of yew, these were not as good wood. And to wield them from a horseback, they held the bow only about a third of the way up the arc of the bow. And you think,
Ooh.
wow, that's weird. And it means you don't get as much draw weight. It allows you to move around and shoot in any direction, but it means their archery, while potentially accurate, did not have huge penetrating power. And the sword was a completely secondary weapon, as likely to be used to cut one's own gut as cut an enemy's head. So, at least until the 16th century, samurai were likely to fight other samurai almost exclusively, as that's where the honor and the glory were, right? And because Japanese lords didn't raise much in the way of infantry troops, and in fact, what they raised even later were called ashigaru, which is another class term. It means lower class warrior. It has no implication, again, of infantry or cavalry use, particularly not, I mean, inevitably they were infantry, but it did not mean infantry. And that only began to change after those more centralized states began to emerge after 1477. So the cult of the sword, as we said, reflected in samurai movies, was this late development that responded to these two contexts: the unification of Japan, which we talked about, and the development in Japanese warfare of these small, strong states that began to raise masses of heavy infantry that forced cavalry into a heavier melee role. So later in the 16th century, and the 17th century especially, you get somewhat heavier cavalry wielding swords and doing charges, but that's in response to facing big masses of infantry. And you can compare them in terms of overall military utility to the ultra-armored knights who faced off against Swiss pikemen in the 15th century. They had to be ultra-armored and as heavy as possible to face these newly fearsome infantry forces, but it actually made them less useful as cavalry forces, because the key for cavalry, as you pointed out earlier, is mobility, the ability to be fast, scout, plunder more widely, get around the flank on a battle. And these ultra-heavy cavalry in complete plate armor were not real good at that because they were slowed down by their weight.
Which is a reason that when the Mongols engaged Western Knights, the Western Knights didn't do well.
No, the Western Knights did not do well, because in the same way that they faced challenges even facing the Turks in the Crusader states, that both sides faced challenges there. I mean, if the Crusaders could pin down a Muslim force and give it a charge, bigger horses, heavier armor, all that, they could win a melee.
Which is what happened at Osu with Richard the Lionheart, because by that point, Richard had resisted allowing his troops to attack for so long. I mean, they had marched 84 miles in like 18 days, and he kept on saying, no, don't attack. And finally, the discipline breaks down. They do attack. Richard turns it into a charge. But by that time, Saladin's troops have been so overconfident that they came too close.
Yes.
And they have lighter horses, and they're now facing a heavy cavalry charge.
That's right.
That's not good for the light cavalry.
That's not good for the light cavalry. But if the light cavalry are prepared and are far enough away, the heavy cavalry charges, the light cavalry simply retreats or feigns retreat or whatever. And then when the heavy cavalry is out of breath and blown
and tired
and scattered, they come back in and run rings around them.
That's a pretty good description of the battles of Legnica and Mohi in 1241, in which the Mongols virtually annihilated first the Polish and then the Hungarian armies, both of which featured knights.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I think that the problem for the Japanese samurai cavalry, let us say in the 1200s, which is when the Europeans were facing the Mongols, the Japanese also faced the Mongols. I think they'd have faced the same problems without having any of the advantages of the European knights. Their horses were slower and had less endurance. They were not as disciplined and unified as the Mongols. They could not have beat them in a face-to-face combat. And the first time the Mongols invaded, the Japanese sort of met them on the beach, and Japanese warfare at this point was somewhat ritualized, and because it was so honor-filled and this is how you fought, they would start battles with a sort of ritual firing of a single whistling arrow. It had a special head on it that would whistle as it goes, and then the tradition was to call out your own name and say, list your accomplishments and say, and I'm going to kill you now. And between Japanese warriors, that was great. It made for wonderful war tales and tales of heroism and who killed who and so forth. They come up and do this to the Mongols, and the Mongols fall out laughing on the beach. It was like, what are these bozos doing? And they don't do well in the initial battle, but then the storm strikes, and the Mongol fleet sinks, and there's only a small group left on shore, and they can overwhelm them. By the time the Mongols come back in the second invasion, which is within a decade, the Japanese have identified where they're going to land. They've built walls around the beaches, and they trap the Mongols there until another storm strikes. The Japanese were not going to overwhelm the Mongols with a heavy cavalry charge, because they weren't heavy cavalry, but they weren't going to fight on even terms with the Mongols as horse archers, because the Mongols had better horses, better bows, compound bows from the steppes, which were shorter but far more powerful, and they could be fired far more rapidly. So the Japanese were at a total disadvantage, and the kamikaze, the divine winds, really did save them.
One of the things that I've noticed about the difference culturally between knights and samurai, there's a pretty famous book about Japanese samurai called The Nobility of Failure. It's by Ivan Morris, 1975.
Yeah.
And the idea is that in Japan, it's the honorable losers who fought so well but lost who get the reputation. That's
Yeah.
not a Western thing.
That's not a Western thing at all.
One of the things that strikes me about something like the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, is yes, they lose at Roncesvalles. Anyway, you could say this is a defeat. But who has the last thing in the field? It's Roland as the last man on the field, and he turns his face toward Spain, showing that the field is his.
Yeah.
And it's a prelude to Charlemagne then coming in and kicking ass.
Yeah.
So it's not really a defeat.
No, that's right. It's a prelude to victory.
And that's very typical of Western.
Oh, I think so. It goes back to Greek and Roman notions. In a rhetorical, cultural sense, it goes back to Julius Caesar, who's like, I'm the hero. And of course, I won. I was a genius, and I won these. And I think Western military history has always revered the conquering winner. You know, Alexander the Great, Scipio beats Hannibal, so that's
and even the losers are basically, as you said, prelude to victory, because that's the story of the Alamo.
Yes.
Wouldn't be, Alamo would not be famous if Texas was still part of Mexico.
That's right. That's right. But in Japan, there really is this sort of the heroic figures around whom the war tales are built are the losers, or noble losers. In the Genpei War, there's the two clans fighting each other, the Minamoto clan who wins and the Genji clan who loses. And there are stories about the losing side, warriors who surrendered too early or sort of ran away. And so it's not that all the losers were honorable.
There is also another motif about knight, and that is that the old knight retires to a monastery. This was in part a response to the anxiety of knights about their spiritual well-being. The ideology of crusading and the religious symbolism that infused the knighting ceremony as it developed in the 13th and 14th centuries were attempts to square the circle between Christian pacifism and chivalric violence. But unless a knight entered one of the military orders, he still lived a life filled with earthly pursuits that the clergy assured him were sinful. The surest way of a knight gaining entry into heaven was to abandon the order of knighthood and become a monk.
Yes, that's correct.
How do you make expiation for your sin? Chivalry is a way of trying to solve that problem.
Yeah. An inadequate enough solution that, as you're right, at the end of their lives, a fair number of European knights, especially big lords, would retire to a monastery and
so they get buried as a monk.
Yes, get buried as a monk, and this would widen the path through the gate into heaven. And interestingly, that actually shows up in Japan as well. There's not quite the same. Christianity is against suicide, so that sort of killing is absolutely a sin. But Buddhism, which was the key religion here for the samurai, also had a notion of killing as a sin. And as a result, a fair number of older samurai, as they got to the end of their lives, entered monastic orders, shaved their heads, and did the same thing that the Europeans did. And I think that speaks to a sort of universal moral sense about killing other people, that no matter how justified you are, many people who do it still need some sort of reassurance that what they did was okay. And therefore, the religions provide this sort of out where, yeah, you can retire with us and then you're all right.
We are running out of time, and I'd like to give you the last word in this episode. What do we learn by trying to compare knights and samurai?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot over the years. I think the key lesson in comparing knights and samurai is that for an historian, superficial similarities and comparisons, and it's easy, as we've established, to compare knights and samurai based on those sort of superficial characteristics of ride horses, warrior, um, feudalism, heavily
Exactly. Yeah.
quoted, can blind us to significant underlying differences. And at worst, that sort of comparison, as was the case in much of the samurai as knights literature from the 60s and 70s, leads to centrisms that shoehorn one culture into the expectations set by another.
Yes.
In this case, European knights and feudalism acting as a bad template for our understanding of Japanese history. That warped a lot of Western understanding of Japanese history for a long time. Or, take it even farther, the myths about European knights and feudalism acting as a bad template for our understanding of both histories.
Yes.
So it's comparison is a nice way to expose what you might be sort of assuming is natural or there, and show that that's not really the way it works.
Historians, especially those who teach, have to make generalizations.
Yeah.
You can't teach just specifics.
Oh,
But the problem with the generalization is that it always falsifies what's actually on the ground at any one time or any one place.
Yeah. And I'm acutely aware of that as a world historian. I love making generalizations. I love coming up with rules about how things happen that are as general
You know,
as
I never noticed that about you.
Oh.
Never mind.
Did you also know I have two eyes and a nose and hair on my head?
Less hair than when I first met you.
Well, that's true. But it's still pretty not great. Yeah, generalizations are dangerous, but they're also useful because that's how we think about things.
There are. So anyway, I just really want to thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. This is fun.
This has been a lot of fun.
Yes.
And maybe you'll come back and we can talk about Chinese medieval warfare and Western medieval warfare.
Yes.
Having gone to China last summer and maybe going back this coming summer, I'm finding it a fascinating culture.
Oh, it's amazing. China studying medieval Chinese warfare will perhaps lead us into a discussion of what the heck we mean by medieval in other parts of the world than Europe.
I know. Again, that's your point, that it's part of this centrism, and it's the idea that a term like medieval can be applied elsewhere.
Yeah, and
as if it's going to have meaning.
And maybe it can, maybe it can't. If you do apply it, you better define it pretty carefully.
Exactly.
And I've got a way to do that, so have me back on and I'll explain it.
So, thank you again, and
thanks for having me on, Richard. This is a blast.
Until next time, bye for now.